My beloved child, something changed the instant your photograph was placed on that small table, because the third party and your special person's ex had arrived expecting one kind of answer, yet the psychic noticed something neither of them had prepared themselves to hear. At first, nothing dramatic happened. There was only a quiet room, a folded cloth beneath the photograph, and two people sitting across from someone they believed would confirm what they had already decided about you. They had come carrying assumptions. They had compared stories, revisited old conversations, and convinced themselves that if they could understand why your special person still seemed emotionally connected to you, everything would finally make sense. But the psychic did not look at them first. She kept her attention on your photograph for several long seconds, almost as though she were searching for a detail that had nothing to do with appearance. Then she asked a question so unexpected that the entire mood shifted. Why did you bring this person here if you already believe you know who they are? Neither of them answered immediately. And that silence became the beginning of everything. Because what they wanted was confirmation. What they received instead was a mirror. The third party leaned forward, ready to explain. Your special person's ex began describing you through fragments, things heard from other people, moments taken out of context, little assumptions collected over time. But the psychic quietly interrupted. She said the photograph was not showing her someone trying to take anything from anyone. It was showing her someone who had spent a long time learning how not to chase what was uncertain. Someone who could care deeply and still step away when respect was missing. Someone whose silence had often been misunderstood because people assumed that if you were not defending yourself loudly, you must not have had anything worth defending. That was the first moment the ex's expression changed. Not because something frightening had been revealed, but because the description was uncomfortably close to something your special person had once said about you. Stay till the end, because this was only the first detail, and the one that followed made their original purpose for going there begin to unravel. The psychic touched the edge of the photograph and asked whether your special person had ever described you as difficult to forget. The third party quickly denied knowing anything about that. But the ex became unusually still. There had been a conversation months earlier, one they had never mentioned to the third party. Your special person had once admitted, quietly and without drama, that there was something different about the way you affected them. They had said it was not simply attraction. It was the uncomfortable feeling of being seen clearly. Around you, pretending became harder. Around you, unfinished emotions became difficult to ignore. Around you, they felt confronted by the difference between what they said they wanted and what they were actually willing to choose. The ex had dismissed those words at the time. Now, hearing a stranger describe almost the same emotional pattern while staring at your photograph made that old conversation return with surprising force. And suddenly, the question was no longer, what is so special about this person? The question became, how much did we misunderstand? Something important is waiting for you here, because the psychic did not tell them that you were perfect. She said something far more believable, and somehow far more powerful. She said you had flaws, uncertainties, and moments when you questioned yourself just like anyone else. But underneath those ordinary human layers, she sensed a pattern. You had learned through experience that genuine connection could not be forced. You might feel deeply, but you were no longer meant to persuade someone to recognize your value. You had reached or were reaching a stage where love had to meet you willingly. And that realization, according to her, was exactly why the emotional dynamic around your special person had begun shifting. Think about that carefully. The third party had entered that room believing your influence came from something you were doing. Perhaps a message. Perhaps attention. Perhaps some secret attempt to pull your special person closer. But the psychic suggested the opposite. Your influence had become stronger precisely because you were not trying to control the outcome. You had stopped carrying the entire connection alone. You had begun allowing distance to reveal what constant effort once concealed. And when a person no longer feels chased, rescued, persuaded, or emotionally managed, they eventually have to sit with their own truth. That was what your special person had been doing. Quietly. Privately. More often than anyone around them realized. The ex suddenly asked, "Are you saying they still think about this person?" The psychic paused. She did not offer some theatrical prediction. Instead, she said, "I think the better question is why thinking about this person seems to change the way they think about themselves." That sentence landed differently. The third party shifted in their seat. Because now this was not about competition. It was about transformation. Your special person's memories of you were apparently connected to moments when they had felt more honest, more open, and more aware of what they truly wanted from a relationship. You represented a chapter they had never emotionally completed because the lesson inside it had never finished speaking to them. Don't skip this part, because here is where the ex became visibly overwhelmed. The psychic looked directly at them and said there was something about your photograph that suggested you had been judged from a distance more often than understood up close. She asked whether the ex had ever met you properly. The answer was not convincing. Perhaps they knew pieces of you. Perhaps they had seen you briefly, heard stories, examined social media, or built an impression based on what others had said. But truly knowing you? Understanding your private disappointments, the patience you had shown, the moments you had chosen peace when reacting would have been easier? No. And the psychic gently pointed out that this was the problem. People had created versions of you in rooms you were never invited into, and then responded to those versions as though they were real. That realization hit the ex harder than expected. Because suddenly, several old conversations looked different. Things they had once interpreted as proof against you now appeared incomplete. Moments when your special person defended you were no longer easy to dismiss as temporary emotion. Times when they became quiet after hearing criticism about you now carried another possibility. Perhaps they had known the criticism was unfair but lacked the courage to challenge everyone around them. The third party tried to redirect the conversation. They asked what your special person actually wanted now. But once again, the psychic refused to give the simple answer they were seeking. She said, "Whatever they choose next will matter less than whether they finally choose honestly." And there it was, the center of the entire story. Your special person had spent too much time making emotional decisions around other people's reactions. They worried about disappointing someone. They worried about reopening old situations. They worried about admitting that certain feelings had survived longer than expected. They worried that choosing what felt authentic might force them to explain why they had resisted it for so long. Yet beneath all those layers, something had been becoming clearer. They missed the version of themselves that existed when they were emotionally truthful with you. Not because every moment between you had been easy, but because something about the connection required honesty. And honesty can feel uncomfortable when a person has spent a long time living through hesitation. Then the psychic noticed another detail. She asked why the photograph they brought was that particular photograph. It seemed like an ordinary question, but the ex froze. Because it had not been chosen randomly. It was an image your special person had looked at before. An image connected to a moment they had once spoken about. Perhaps there was something in your expression, some quiet softness or confidence, that had stayed in their memory. The third party did not know that when they selected it. The ex did. And for the first time, the ex admitted something they had kept hidden from the third party. Your special person had once stared at that same photograph longer than they realized anyone noticed. They had not said much. They had simply become quiet. Then they put the phone down and changed the subject. At the time, the ex convinced themselves it meant nothing. But now the psychic asked, why would someone change the subject if there was nothing inside them to change? The room became silent again. That silence was no longer awkward. It was revealing. Because one by one, little pieces were aligning. Not into a fantasy. Not into some guaranteed ending. Into something subtler. Your special person had never become as emotionally indifferent as other people assumed. They had learned to function around their feelings. They had learned to distract themselves. They had learned to call unfinished emotion the past. But unfinished does not always mean active pursuit. Sometimes it simply means there is a truth someone has never fully faced. And your photograph had placed that truth back in the center of the room. The psychic then said something that changed the ex's entire expression. She said the most remarkable thing she sensed was not that you were destined to win against anyone. It was that you were gradually becoming someone who no longer measured love by whether another person chose you quickly enough. You were becoming more grounded in yourself. And that meant if your special person ever approached you again, the dynamic could not return to what it once was. They would have to meet you differently. With clarity. With consistency. With courage. The old version of the connection could not simply restart. Something would have to mature. That was what overwhelmed the ex. They had expected the psychic to reveal some hidden advantage they could compete with. Instead, she described something competition could not touch: growth. You were not standing in the same emotional place anymore. And neither, perhaps, was your special person. A strange understanding began appearing in that room. The third party had been watching your special person become quieter recently. The ex had noticed them revisiting old memories in small ways. Neither had connected those changes to the possibility that your special person was reconsidering their own choices rather than simply reconsidering you. But now the pieces were difficult to ignore. There had been a night not long ago when your special person had been asked what they would do differently if they could return to one important moment in their past. Everyone expected a casual answer. Instead, they hesitated. They looked down. And after a long pause, they said, "Would have listened to myself sooner." At the time, no one asked who or what they meant. The psychic had never heard that story. Yet her next words were almost unsettling in their simplicity. This person reminds them of a decision they wish they had made with more courage. The ex's eyes widened. The third party stopped interrupting. And suddenly your photograph was not just a photograph anymore. It had become a symbol of a question your special person had been quietly carrying. What happens when you realize the person you tried to move beyond was never the real thing you were avoiding? What if what you were actually avoiding was the version of yourself you would have needed to become in order to love them properly? That was the deeper revelation. Your special person may not have been running from you. They may have been running from the honesty your connection demanded. And now, after enough distance, enough reflection, and enough moments where distraction failed to erase what mattered, that honesty was returning. Softly. Patiently. Without demanding anything. The psychic leaned back and finally removed her hand from the photograph. For several seconds, she said nothing. Then she looked toward the ex and asked one final question. Did they ever tell you what happened the last time they almost contacted this person? The ex's face changed immediately. The third party turned toward them. Apparently, there was something they knew that they had never shared. Something recent. Something involving a message your special person had written, stared at, and then refused to send. And the reason they stopped themselves had nothing to do with losing interest. In fact, it was almost the exact opposite. The ex lowered their eyes, realizing that the next truth could no longer remain hidden, and what they were about to admit would explain why your special person had been acting differently ever since. The ex did not answer immediately, and that hesitation told the third party more than any explanation could have. For the first time since entering the room, confidence disappeared from their face. The psychic noticed it too, but she did not rush to fill the silence. She simply waited, allowing the truth to become heavier on its own. Finally, the ex admitted that your special person had written a message to you late one evening, a message far longer than anything they would normally send. They had typed it slowly, stopped several times, erased entire sentences, then started again. It was not dramatic. It was not a confession designed to change your entire life in one moment. It was something much more vulnerable. Your special person had been trying to explain why they had stayed silent for so long. They wanted to tell you that there were moments when reaching out felt easy in their imagination, but frightening once their hand actually hovered over the screen. Because contacting you meant they might have to face questions they had been avoiding inside themselves. Why had they allowed other voices to influence them? Why had they waited until distance changed everything? Why had they assumed you would always remain emotionally available while they tried to understand what they wanted? Those were not comfortable questions. And somewhere in the middle of writing that message, your special person realized they did not want to approach you merely because they missed you. Missing someone was not enough. They wanted to know whether they could return with something stronger than longing. They wanted honesty. They wanted intention. They wanted the courage to say what they could actually offer instead of simply asking whether you still cared. That was why they never pressed send. The third party listened with a strange expression because this detail changed the meaning of everything they had been observing. They had thought your special person's recent silence meant the connection with you was fading. Instead, that silence may have been the first sign that they were taking their feelings more seriously than before. Something important is waiting for you here, because the psychic then said the unsent message was not the most revealing part of the story. The most revealing part was what happened afterward. Your special person did not delete it. They saved it. They returned to it another night and read it again. Then again days later. Each time, they changed something small, as though the message were evolving alongside them. One sentence became softer. Another became more accountable. A line that originally blamed timing disappeared completely. Another line that suggested circumstances had kept you apart was replaced by something more honest. They had made choices, and those choices had consequences. That shift mattered. It meant your special person was beginning to stop telling themselves that everything happened because of outside interference. Yes, other people had opinions. Yes, the third party had influenced certain situations. Yes, the X had participated in conversations that shaped how your special person saw things. But eventually, a person has to acknowledge where their own decisions began. And your special person had started doing exactly that. The psychic looked toward the third party and asked whether they understood why this mattered. At first, they said nothing. Then she explained gently that people often become uncomfortable when someone they care about starts taking emotional responsibility, because responsibility changes relationships. Once your special person stopped blaming circumstances, they also stopped needing everyone around them to approve of their feelings. That was the real shift the third party had been sensing. Your special person was becoming less interested in defending their choices and more interested in understanding them. And the more they understood, the harder it became to ignore what your connection had represented. Don't skip this moment, because something subtle happened next. The X admitted there was another detail from that night. After writing the message, your special person had opened an old conversation between the two of you. They did not scroll through everything. They stopped at one particular exchange. It was not romantic in an obvious way. There were no grand declarations. It was something simple you had once said when they were going through a confusing period. You had told them, in your own way, that they did not have to have every answer immediately, but they did need to be honest with themselves. At the time, your special person had responded casually. Perhaps they even changed the subject. But that sentence stayed with them. Years of emotion can sometimes hide inside a few ordinary words, and only distance reveals which words mattered most. Your special person had returned to that message because they finally understood what you had meant. You were never asking them to become perfect for you. You were asking them to stop hiding from themselves. The psychic smiled faintly when she heard this. Then she said, "That is why this photograph feels different to them now." The X looked confused, so the psychic explained. When your special person looked at your photo before, they may have seen someone they wanted, someone they missed, someone connected to memories that were emotionally complicated. Now, however, they were beginning to see something else. A person they had once underestimated because they were not ready to appreciate what emotional steadiness looked like. That realization did not make them feel only romantic longing. It brought respect. And respect changes the entire emotional landscape. Attraction can be ignored. Nostalgia can be dismissed. Even longing can sometimes be distracted. But once a person begins respecting the way someone carried themselves through disappointment, distance, and misunderstanding, forgetting becomes much harder. The third party suddenly asked whether that meant your special person intended to return. The psychic shook her head gently. She would not turn uncertainty into a promise. She said intention was still forming. What mattered was that your special person's internal story about you had changed. They were no longer asking themselves whether the connection had been real. She said, you seem to be moving away from the need for immediate answers. Your standards may have changed. Your emotional boundaries may have become clearer. The psychic said that if anything meaningful were ever rebuilt, it would have to happen between who you are now, not who either of you used to be. That meant old assumptions had to fall away. Your special person could not return expecting immediate access to your heart simply because history existed. They would have to approach you with humility. They would have to understand that silence may have taught you things their words never did. They would have to listen without immediately explaining themselves. And they would have to accept that you were allowed to take your time. Strangely, that possibility did not seem to discourage your special person when the ex later described it. In fact, there had already been signs they were thinking this way. They had recently asked someone close to them a question that seemed random at first. How do you apologize to someone when you know the apology isn't supposed to guarantee anything? The person they asked laughed lightly and said, you apologize because it is true, not because you want something back. Your special person became quiet after hearing that. Very quiet. The ex had been there. They had watched their expression change. And now, sitting across from the psychic, they finally understood who that question had probably been about. The third party turned toward them with disbelief. You knew this? They asked. The ex replied that they had suspected, but suspicion was different from wanting to admit it. Because admitting it meant accepting that your special person's connection to you was not merely an old habit they could talk them out of. It was attached to personal growth. Every time your special person reflected on you, they seemed to reflect on themselves too. That was why criticism of you had stopped working the way it once did. The third party had noticed this recently. In the past, when someone said something skeptical about you, your special person might have stayed silent, perhaps even nodded to avoid conflict. But now they were beginning to respond differently. Not angrily. Not defensively. Just clearly. Someone had recently made a dismissive remark about you during a casual conversation. Your special person looked at them and said, you don't actually know them. Nothing more. Yet the room went strangely quiet afterward. It was such a simple sentence, but it marked a major change. Your special person had finally separated other people's opinions from their own experience. And once that separation happened, the emotional influence surrounding them began weakening. The psychic heard this and nodded slowly. She said that sentence may have been more important than anyone realized. Because when a person starts correcting the story others tell about someone, it usually means they have stopped outsourcing their own perception. Your special person was beginning to trust what they had personally witnessed in you. Your kindness when nobody rewarded it. Your restraint when conflict would have been easier. Your ability to understand their emotions without humiliating them for having them. Your willingness to walk away rather than turn affection into a struggle for control. Those memories had become evidence inside them. And evidence is harder to erase than gossip. Then came the realization that left the ex almost speechless. The psychic said, "You brought this photograph here hoping to understand why they cannot fully let go. But maybe the reason is not mysterious at all. Maybe they cannot let go because they never finished becoming the person they knew they needed to be when they were around this person." The ex stared at your photograph again. This time, their expression was different. There was less resistance in it. More recognition. They admitted that your special person had once said something remarkably similar after an argument long ago. They had said, "They make me want to get my life together, and I don't know why that scares me." No one in the room knew what to say after that. Because suddenly the story became clearer. Your connection was never powerful because it was perfect. It was powerful because it revealed something. It showed your special person where they were emotionally mature and where they were not. It showed them what kind of honesty they were capable of and how quickly fear could make them retreat from it. It showed them that being deeply understood could feel beautiful and uncomfortable at the same time. And now, after all this distance, they were beginning to see that the discomfort had never meant the connection was wrong. Sometimes discomfort comes from being invited to grow. The psychic then turned the photograph face down on the table. The third party immediately asked why. She said, "Because we have spent enough time looking at this person. The next thing you need to understand is happening somewhere else." She asked the ex to tell her everything they knew about your special person's behavior during the previous 3 days. At first, the ex mentioned ordinary things. They had been quieter. They had declined an invitation. They had spent more time alone. Then they remembered something unusual. Your special person had recently gone through a drawer where they kept old belongings. They had found something connected to you, something small enough to have been forgotten by everyone else, yet meaningful enough that when they held it, they sat down and stayed there for several minutes. The third party had never heard this before. "What was it?" they asked. The ex hesitated again. It was an old handwritten note, not even a full letter, something you had given your special person during a moment they barely appreciated at the time. There were only a few lines on it. But one sentence had been underlined. Your special person read that sentence again and again. Then they took out their phone. They opened your contact. And this time, instead of typing a long message they might never send, they wrote only 7 words. 7 words that revealed something had changed inside them. The ex had accidentally seen the screen just before your special person locked the phone, and what those 7 words said would completely explain why the third party's place in this story was beginning to feel far less certain than they wanted to admit. For several seconds, the ex seemed unwilling to repeat those 7 words aloud, because saying them inside that room would make something impossible to dismiss. The third party leaned closer, expecting perhaps a dramatic confession, but the truth was quieter than that and somehow much more meaningful. Your special person had written, "I finally understand what you meant now." 7 simple words. No declaration. No demand. No attempt to pull you back into the past. Yet beneath them was an entire emotional shift. Because your special person had not written, "I miss you." They had not written, "Come back." They had not written anything designed to guarantee a response. They had written something that admitted growth. Something that acknowledged that a message you once gave them had taken time to become clear. The psychic listened carefully, then asked the X what had been written on the old note they found. That question brought another pause. The X could not remember every line, but one sentence had stayed with them because your special person had read it repeatedly. When you know what matters, don't let fear make the choice for you. Suddenly the 7-word message made sense. Your special person had spent so long believing the difficult part was choosing between people, circumstances, expectations, or timing. But now they were beginning to understand that the deeper choice had always been between honesty and avoidance. The note had not predicted anything. It had simply reminded them of a truth they had once been unable to live by. The third party stared at the table as the psychic quietly asked, "Did they send the message?" The X shook their head. "Not yet." Your special person had written it, read it several times, then left it sitting unsent. But this time their hesitation felt different. Previously, they had stopped themselves because they were overwhelmed by everything they wanted from you. Now they were stopping because they were asking what would be fair to you. Would sending those words bring clarity, or would it disturb peace you had worked hard to rebuild? Would it be honest, or would it simply be another moment when they reached for you because their own emotions had become difficult to carry? That difference was enormous. For perhaps the first time, your special person was considering your experience as carefully as their own. And the psychic said something neither the third party nor the X expected: that hesitation may be healthier than the old urgency. The third party looked confused. They had assumed that if your special person truly cared, they would simply act. But the psychic explained that mature feelings do not always create immediate action. Sometimes they create reflection. Sometimes a person finally understands that wanting access to someone does not automatically mean they are entitled to it. Sometimes respect sounds like waiting until your intention becomes clear enough that you are not asking another person to carry your confusion. That was the place your special person seemed to be entering now. Don't skip this, because the next detail changed the way the X viewed an interaction they had witnessed only 2 days earlier. Your special person had been sitting with someone they trusted, someone completely outside the tension surrounding you, and that person had asked why they seemed distracted lately. Your special person tried to laugh it away, but eventually they admitted, "I think I misunderstood someone who was actually trying to be good to me." The friend asked whether they were talking about you. Your special person did not answer directly. They only said, "I kept waiting for certainty before I acted, and eventually my waiting became an answer." That line stayed with the X because there was no blame inside it. No criticism of you. No criticism of the third party. Not even criticism of circumstances. Your special person was beginning to understand that indecision itself had consequences. While they waited to feel perfectly certain, life continued. You continued. Time continued. And the connection they assumed would remain exactly where they left it began changing without their permission. The psychic leaned back when she heard this and said softly, "That is probably why they are looking at this person differently now." The third party asked what she meant. She explained that your special person may once have viewed you mainly through emotion, how strongly they felt, how confusing the connection seemed, how vulnerable it made them. But now they were beginning to see you through consequence. They were asking themselves what their silence may have taught you. What their inconsistency may have communicated even if they never intended it. What it must have felt like to care about someone who repeatedly stepped forward and backward depending on fear. Those questions were not comfortable, but they were necessary. And something inside your special person had become strong enough to stop avoiding them. There is a rare moment in emotional growth when a person stops asking, "Why did this happen to me?" and begins asking, "How did I participate in what happened?" Your special person seemed to be reaching that moment. That was why the psychic had reacted so strongly when she first studied your photograph. It was not because she saw some impossible secret hidden inside you. It was because the story everyone brought into the room did not match the emotional pattern she was hearing once they began telling the truth. The third party had described you as an obstacle. The X had described you as an unresolved chapter. But the evidence suggested something very different. You had become a point of reflection in your special person's life. Thinking about you forced them to confront choices they had made when they were less certain of themselves. Remembering you reminded them of qualities they now valued more than they once did. And most importantly, the distance between you had taught them that meaningful people cannot simply be placed on pause until someone feels ready. Something important is waiting for you here, because the third party finally asked the question that had been underneath everything from the moment they walked into that room. What does this mean for me? The psychic looked at them for a long moment before answering. She did not tell them they were about to lose anything. She did not turn the situation into a competition. Instead, she said, "It means you cannot build peace by trying to control what another person understands about their own heart." The room became still. The third party had spent enormous emotional energy watching your special person's reactions to you. They noticed when your name changed their expression. They noticed when certain memories made them quiet. They noticed when your special person defended you, when they avoided discussing you, when they seemed distracted after seeing something connected to you. And with every little observation, the third party tried harder to determine what it meant for their own position. But the psychic suggested that perhaps the healthiest thing everyone could do was stop treating your special person's emotions like territory. They were a human being trying to understand themselves. You were a human being continuing your own life. The X was carrying their own history. And the third party had their own dignity to protect too. No one needed to become the villain for someone else to become important. That realization softened the room. The tension did not disappear, but its meaning changed. For the first time, the third party stopped asking how to make your special person forget you. Instead, they asked whether forgetting was even necessary. The psychic answered with another quiet question: if someone truly understands a chapter of their life, why would they need to erase it? Sometimes moving forward does not require forgetting. Sometimes it requires finally seeing something accurately. Your special person may eventually choose to reach out to you, or they may decide that respecting what the connection taught them means allowing you space. What mattered was that whatever came next could no longer be built on denial. And strangely, that idea seemed to affect the X most deeply. Because the X had also been carrying a private resentment toward you, not necessarily because of anything you had personally done, but because your presence represented something they could not compete with, a memory your special person interpreted differently over time. The ex had spent months believing that if they could make your special person see you less positively, the emotional distance would finally disappear. Yet every attempt to reduce you had produced the opposite effect. Criticism made your special person remember moments when you had been misunderstood. Doubt made them revisit things they had personally witnessed. And pressure made them ask why everyone seemed so invested in telling them what they should feel. Eventually, the outside noise pushed them inward, and inward was precisely where the truth had been waiting. Stay till the end, because what happened after the psychic session mattered even more than what happened inside it. The third party and the ex left together, but neither spoke for several minutes. They had entered expecting information about you. They left thinking about themselves. The ex was the first to break the silence. "We probably made this bigger by fighting it," they said. The third party did not respond immediately. Then they admitted something surprising. Every time they had tried to convince your special person that you were irrelevant, they noticed your special person become more thoughtful afterward. Not more romantic. Not more impulsive. More thoughtful. It was as if being told what to believe made them go back and examine their own memories more carefully. And each examination seemed to bring them closer to one uncomfortable conclusion: their feelings about you had never been fully theirs because they had allowed too many other people to interpret them. Now they wanted those feelings back, not necessarily so they could immediately choose you, but so they could finally understand what was genuinely theirs. Later that evening, the ex received a message from your special person. It was ordinary at first. A question about something completely unrelated. But near the end, your special person added one sentence: "Have you ever realized too late that someone was trying to protect your peace, not disturb it?" The ex stared at that line for a long time. They knew immediately who it was about. Because there had been a period when your special person interpreted your boundaries as distance. When you stopped explaining yourself, they thought you no longer cared. When you stopped chasing clarity, they assumed you were giving up. When you became quieter, they believed the connection meant less to you. But now they were beginning to see those moments differently. Perhaps you were not trying to punish them with silence. Perhaps you were protecting yourself from an emotional pattern that had become exhausting. Perhaps your distance had not been indifference at all. It may have been self-respect. That realization changed something fundamental inside your special person because it meant the story they had been telling themselves was incomplete. They had thought you walked away because you did not care enough to stay. Now they were considering whether you stepped back because you cared enough about yourself to stop accepting uncertainty. The ex answered carefully, "Sometimes people protect peace because they've tried everything else." Your special person read the reply but did not respond for nearly an hour. Then came another message. "I think I understand that now." Those words echoed the 7-word draft still sitting unsent in their phone. They were not suddenly solving every emotion. They were slowly arriving at the same truth from different directions. And somewhere inside that realization was a new question: if they ever spoke to you again, could they do it without asking you to return to the person you had been before? Could they meet you where you were now? The answer frightened them a little because it required something more difficult than sending a message. It required change they could demonstrate, not merely describe. Over the next few days, the third party noticed small differences. Your special person stopped participating when conversations drifted into speculation about you. If someone asked what they thought you were doing, they said, "I don't know, and I hope they're doing well." When someone tried to reopen an old complaint, your special person said, "I think we all saw parts of that situation from our own perspective." There was no dramatic defense, no argument, no emotional performance. Just steadiness. And perhaps that was the clearest sign of growth. Your special person was no longer trying to prove that you were perfect. They were simply refusing to participate in a version of you they no longer believed was fair. The third party, strangely enough, began softening too. The psychic's words had stayed with them, "You cannot build peace by controlling someone else's heart." They started asking themselves why your existence had felt so threatening in the first place. Was it because of something you had actually done? Or because your special person's unresolved feelings made them uncertain about their own place? Those were different problems, and recognizing the difference brought relief. They did not need to defeat you. They needed clarity about what they themselves deserved. If your special person could not be emotionally present, then the third party deserved honesty too. If the past was still shaping the present, pretending otherwise helped no one. This realization did not turn anyone against anyone else. It simply made the situation more truthful. And that truth gradually removed the need for secret comparisons, assumptions, and attempts to interpret every little sign. Then, one quiet evening, your special person opened that unsent 7-word message again. This time they did not edit it. They read the sentence slowly, "I finally understand what you meant now." Their thumb hovered over the send button. They imagined several possibilities. Perhaps you would answer warmly. Perhaps cautiously. Perhaps not at all. For the first time, they understood that all three possibilities had to be respected. Reaching out could not be an attempt to control your response. It had to be an offering of honesty with no guarantee attached. And just when it seemed they were finally ready to send it, something unexpected appeared on their screen. Not a message from you. Not a call. A photograph they had forgotten was still saved in an old folder. It showed a moment involving you that everyone else had completely overlooked, and when your special person remembered what happened immediately after that photograph was taken, they put the phone down, closed their eyes, and realized there was one truth they needed to face before they contacted you at all.